1959, February. Soviet Union, the Ural Mountains. A group of 9 people decides to embark on a trek to Mount Kholat-Syakhl, which translates from the local Mansi language as Mountain of the Dead. Soon, all members of the expedition will be found dead. Their bodies will bear strange injuries, with some missing their eyes and even their tongues. The bodies were discovered on an unnamed mountain pass, which the whole world would later know as Dyatlov Pass. From the very beginning of the investigation, completely unexpected facts began to emerge. Could the hikers have died during the testing of a new weapon? Or was the KGB, or perhaps even foreign intelligence, involved? January 23, 1959. At the dormitory of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, 9 friends, all students in their early 20s, are busy preparing for their expedition. Each of them is gathering everything necessary: food, equipment, medical supplies, and other essentials. Overseeing the preparations with great attention is Igor Dyatlov, the leader of the group. Igor Dyatlov, despite his young age, he already had experience in over 10 expeditions, most of which he led as the group leader. The group included 2 women, Zenaida Kolmogorova and Lyudmila Dubinina. Zenaida Kolmogorova was 22 years old at the start of the expedition, while Lyudmila Dubinina was the youngest member of the group, only 20 years old. Yuri Doroshenko, 21 years old, was previously in a relationship with Zenaida Kolmogorova. At the time of the expedition's start, Igor Dyatlov was showing interest in Zenaida. Georgy Krivonoshenko, 23 years old. He was a participant in the cleanup efforts of the so-called Kishtim disaster, one of the first nuclear accidents in the Soviet Union. Alexander Kolevatov, 24 years old. He kept a diary that he carefully hid from his comrades. Rustam Slobodin, 23 years old, the most athletic member of the group. He was passionate about long-distance running. Nikolai Thibault Brunel, 24 years old. His surname came from his great-grandfather, who had immigrated from France to the Russian Empire. He specialized in drafting maps and plans of the terrain, including one for this expedition. Yuri Yudin, 21 years old. He was responsible for medical supplies during the expedition. Once all the preparations were complete, the group headed to the train station. There, they were joined by the 10th member of the expedition, someone who would later become the most controversial and enigmatic figure of the group. Semyon Zolotaryov, 37 years old. He introduced himself to the group as Alexander, although his official name, according to his passport, was Semyon. Adding to the mystery, he had a tattoo with the name Gina, which was highly unusual. Tattoos in general were rare in the Soviet Union at the time. Initially, Semyon Zolotaryov was supposed to join another group for an expedition a bit earlier, but due to personal circumstances he couldn't, and instead asked to join Dyatlov's group. You might have noticed that the group now had 10 members, yet earlier it was mentioned that 9 bodies were found. The reason for this is that just one day before the expedition began, Yuri Yudin fell ill and had to leave the group, which ultimately saved his life. According to the plan, Dyatlov and his group intended to traverse the northern Urals, ascend Mount Otorten, and then head back, arriving in the village of Vizhai by February 12th to send a telegram confirming their successful return to the Institute. Before the expedition began, the weather conditions had significantly worsened. Because of this, on the day they parted ways with Yuri Yudin, Dyatlov asked him to inform the Institute that their return might be delayed by a few days, possibly until February 16th. When no telegram was received from Dyatlov on either February 12th or February 16th, no one raised an alarm. Delays were not uncommon in such expeditions. The official search operation didn't begin until February 20th. Surprisingly, the first searchers weren't military or police, but several ordinary hiking groups from Sverdlovsk. An AN-2 airplane was dispatched to fly over Dyatlov's proposed route. The searchers hoped to spot either the hikers themselves or signs they might have left behind. Representatives of the local Mansi people, who were familiar with the terrain, also volunteered to help in the search. The first few days of searching yielded no results. The harsh winter weather in this region slowed down progress significantly. February 25th. The first breakthrough. One of the search groups manages to find a faint ski trail in the valley of the Ospir River. The group begins following the trail. February 26th. A few searchers on skis reach the pass that connects Mount Kholat-Syakhl and an unnamed height, labeled Elevation 950. From there, they spot a small black dot in the distance. As they approach, it becomes clear. It's Dyatlov's tent. Near the tent, several skis were stuck upright in the snow. At the entrance, an ice axe was sticking out of the snow. Next to it was a storm jacket belonging to Dyatlov. Part of the tent was buried under about 8 inches of snow. For the search group, it was strange to find the tent in such an exposed area. Someone as experienced as Dyatlov would have likely pitched the tent lower down the slope, near the trees in a stream, where conditions would have been more sheltered. When the searchers entered the tent, they found no one, neither alive nor dead. This gave them a faint glimmer of hope that the group might still be alive. During an initial search of the tent's interior, they found 4 cameras, a flask containing alcohol, a box with documents and money, and a working flashlight on top of the tent. The discovery of the alcohol and money was another reassuring detail. Both were valuable, which allowed searchers to almost entirely rule out the possibility of an attack by escaped criminals. One of the most important discoveries, however, was the group's diary. The last entry in the diary was dated January 31st. Inside the diary, the group's future plans were outlined. The hikers had left the Ospia River Valley and intended to reach their final destination, Mount Otorten, in 2 days. After examining the tent, the search team split into 2 groups to continue searching the surrounding area. The first group, about 65 feet down the slope, discovered footprints. Some of the prints were large, while others were noticeably smaller. This seemed unusual, as if some individuals were wearing shoes while others were walking barefoot. There were exactly 9 sets of footprints, matching the number of expedition members. The footprints led toward the Lozva River Valley, stretching for approximately 1,500 feet. Initially, the tracks stayed together, then split into 2 parallel groups before rejoining and disappearing under freshly fallen snow. The tracks appeared to show an organized procession. Meanwhile, about 5,000 feet from the tent in the Lozva River Valley, the second search group was surveying the area. As they passed a tall cedar near a stream, they came across evidence of a campfire. Even at first glance, it was clear the fire had been hastily built. About 30 feet from the campfire, the searchers noticed something strange sticking out from under the snow. This led to the discovery of the first 2 bodies. It was Doroshenko and Krivonoshenko. Neither of the victims were wearing jackets or even trousers. Yuri Doroshenko. He was barefoot, wearing only woolen socks on both feet. The skin color at the time of discovery had turned purple-brown. The body was found in an unnatural position, as if it had been moved after death. His ears, nose, and lips were covered in blood. On his right cheek, there was dried gray foamy liquid, which might indicate that someone had applied pressure to his chest before death. This was one of the known interrogation techniques used by the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. Cause of death? Hypothermia. Georgy Krivonoshenko. He was dressed in a t-shirt, a plaid long-sleeve shirt, swim trunks, long underwear, and 1 sock on his left foot. He was barefoot. There were traces of skin found in his teeth, suggesting that he may have bitten his own hand to stay conscious through the pain while his body was freezing. Cause of death? Hypothermia. After the discovery of the first 2 bodies, the search team continued to examine the area. On the slope of Mount Kolotsykol, on the path from the abandoned tent to the cedar, another body was found. This was Igor Dyatlov, the leader of the group. Igor Dyatlov. He was dressed in an unbuttoned jacket, which is unusual for someone freezing to death. He also wore a sweater and pants. He was barefoot. On his left foot, he had a cotton sock, and on his right foot, a woolen sock. His skin had turned a blue-red shade by the time of discovery. The knuckles of his right hand had brown-red bruises, typical of hand-to-hand combat. He was still wearing his wristwatch, which had stopped at 5:31 a.m. local time. Around 2,000 feet from the cedar tree, a dog found another frozen body, a woman. In contrast to the other victims, she was dressed relatively warmly, with a jacket, hat, and pants. But like the others, she was barefoot with only socks. There were noticeable blood traces on her face. Later, the victim was identified as Zenaida Kolmogorova. Zenaida Kolmogorova. The skin color at the time of discovery was purple-red. She was wearing a hat, a long-sleeve t-shirt, a jacket, a plaid shirt, and a sweater. There was another sweater with the right sleeve torn off. It's unclear whether she tore it herself or if someone else did. She was barefoot, wearing only socks. Cause of death: hypothermia. On March 5th, about 1,600 feet from the cedar, another body was discovered. This was a man, lying face down in the snow. The body was identified as Rustem Slobodin. Rustem Slobodin. The position of the body indicated that he had been moving towards the tent. Compared to the other victims, he was dressed. He wore a ski hat, a long-sleeve t-shirt, a shirt, a sweater, long underwear, and pants. He had 4 pairs of socks and a felt boot on his right foot. His wristwatch had stopped at 8:45 a.m. There was a depression in the snow under his head, suggesting that Rustem was still breathing when he fell. His forehead, nose, neck, and cheeks had small abrasions and scratches, with dried blood under his nose. The autopsy revealed a trauma to the occipital part of the skull, described in the case as injury caused by a strong force. Many might think this was a result of falling, but specialists argue that injuries from falling typically affect the palms and knees. The skull can only be injured by direct impact with a hard object, like a rock or something similar. It seems more probable that someone or something caused this trauma with a blow from behind. Meanwhile, an examination of the tent was underway. Specifically, the cuts on the tent were analyzed. A seamstress involved in the investigation confidently stated that the cuts were made deliberately with a knife. An important detail: the cuts were made from the inside, not the outside. This suggests that the group members were likely trying to cut their way out of the tent for some urgent reason. This raises the question, what could have forced them to do this? Another unresolved question was the location of the remaining 4 bodies. Searches continued tirelessly, but the remainder of March and all of April yielded no results. It wasn't until early May, when the snow began to melt, that an unexpected discovery occurred. May 4th, a Mansi hunter discovered a frozen pant leg in the snow, as if it had been cut off. Nearby, there was a piece of a sweater. Later that same day, the 6th body was found. The body was buried under 13 feet of snow near a stream. It was identified as Lyudmila Dubinina. She was wearing 2 long-sleeve shirts and 2 sweaters. One of the sweaters belonged to Georgy Krivonoshenko. There were traces of radiation on one of the sweaters. She had multiple broken ribs. The most unusual discovery was that she had no tongue, but also the absence of the sublingual muscle, suggesting that the tongue was likely torn out. Cause of death: internal hemorrhage. An unusual aspect of her case was that her autopsy was the shortest of all the victims, despite her having the most injuries. During further excavation, 3 more male bodies were found close to each other. They appeared to be lying together, suggesting they tried to huddle together for warmth in their final moments. These bodies were identified as Zolotaryov, Kolevatov, and Thibaut Brunel. Semyon Zolotaryov: clothing, 2 hats, scarf, 2 shirts, sweater, coat, pants, leather handmade boots known as burqa. Zolotaryov was quickly identified by his tattoos. However, an interesting fact is that Semyon's parents claimed their son never had any tattoos. The tattoos themselves were very strange, consisting only of sets of letters with no apparent logic. The most unusual discovery was a camera found around his neck. This came as a great surprise to everyone. It was known that there were 4 cameras in the group, which were intended for future reporting, and all of them were found in the tent. However, this camera was the 5th one, and no one knew about it. Unfortunately, due to water exposure, the film was damaged, and the photographs were lost forever. But this discovery raises many questions. Why didn't Semyon mention this camera earlier? Why did he take it with him when fleeing the tent, as it was clearly not an essential item? And finally, what did Semyon capture with the camera in the final moments of his life? Like Lyudmila, Semyon also had multiple rib fractures and internal bleeding, as well as bleeding in the pleural cavity, indicating that Semyon was still alive when he sustained the injuries, and they were inflicted under the influence of great force. Alexander Kolevatov. He was wearing a ski jacket which was open, 2 shirts, 2 sweaters, trousers. Radiation traces were found on one of the sweaters and the trousers. Alexander had a broken nose and a deformed cervical vertebra. There was also an open wound on his ear, which resembled a wound inflicted during a fight. One of the characteristic techniques used by special forces for killing involves a similar type of strike. Nikolai Thibaut Brunel. He was also well dressed. Woolen hat, 2 shirts, woolen sweater, jacket, woolen gloves, trousers, woolen socks, valinki, felt boots. He had a deep depressed skull fracture. The forensic expert excluded falling and the possibility of hitting a stone as the cause of the injury. Such a trauma was again attributed to impact of great force. Moreover, after receiving these injuries, Nikolai would not have been able to move on his own, so he was either carried or dragged to the location of his death. In the end, 6 out of 9 deaths in the medical examiner's reports were listed as deaths from hypothermia, and 3 were marked as violent. However, the term violent remains unclear. Does it refer to the influence of natural forces or human involvement? Without exaggeration, this fact puts the investigation at a standstill. Version number 1, natural, an avalanche. This sounds quite logical. According to statistics, 80% of people who die in snowy mountains perish in an avalanche. However, this theory quickly fell apart. Moreover, the local Monzis claim that they haven't witnessed a single avalanche in this area in the last 60 years. Additionally, the tent and skis near it remained in place, which would not have happened if an avalanche had occurred. But within this version, an interesting sub-theory emerged, which seems more plausible. There's a phenomenon known as a snow slab. This is not a classic avalanche that everyone knows. According to this version, when the tourists set up the tent, they could have driven it so deeply into the snow that a layer of snow, about 2 feet thick, could have slid over them, burying them under its weight. This could explain the fact that some group members had broken ribs and head injuries, as well as why some of them were without clothing. The snow slab could have slid unexpectedly when they were changing clothes and preparing for bed. It also makes sense that the tent was cut from the inside. It is assumed that after the snow slab descended, the group cut the tent open to escape. Those members of the group who were injured were lowered down to the creek and tried to keep them warm as best as they could, which explains why they were found with the most clothing on. Meanwhile, the rest froze while attempting to find their way back to the tent. This explanation sounds more plausible. However, there are still several questions. Why were different members of the group found on opposite sides of the tent? Why were the belongings inside the tent undamaged by the avalanche, but the avalanche was still able to cause rib injuries to the tourists? And why, in this case, were several victims found without their eyeballs? And why was Lyudmila Dubinina's tongue ripped out? Version number 2, attack by the Mansi people. The main idea of this version was that the Dyatlov group had entered a sacred place for the Mansi people, desecrating it, which led to the Mansi attacking them. However, it was later revealed that the Mansi do not have many sacred places, and Mount Halachal was never considered one of them. Furthermore, their nearest settlement is located about 60 miles from the tragedy site. The fact that the tent was almost completely cut from the inside virtually rules out the attack theory. Another contradiction to this version is that members of the Mansi tribe were among the first to go on the search for the group. Version number 3, radiation, secret tests, and UFOs. This version is not the most obvious, and appeared after the case was officially closed. However, it does contain some interesting details. A request was made by the investigator in the case for an additional physical technical examination to identify traces of radiation on the bodies or clothing of the deceased. The examination did not reveal any traces of radiation on the bodies, but some of the tourists' clothing was found to be contaminated with radiation. Specifically, the sweater of Lyudmila Dubinina and the sweater of Alexander Kolevatov. The deviation from the norm was almost twice as high. A logical question arises: where could radiation come from in the mountains? Proponents of this theory claim that on the night of the incident, specifically from February 1st to 2nd, bright fireballs were seen in the sky above the area, which eventually disappeared into the air. This theory is also supported by one of the last photographs taken by the group. Naturally, the quality of cameras back then was nowhere near as advanced as today, but it's clear that the photo was taken at night, and the object on the left closely resembles the fireball described by witnesses. After this, the group of supporters for the theory split into two camps. The first group argued that the authorities were conducting tests of new secret weapons in such remote mountains to keep them hidden, and that the injuries sustained by some of the group members were a result of the shockwave from these weapons, while the radiation was a logical residual effect of the tests. The second group claimed that the circles in the sky were nothing more than UFOs. They believed that all the injuries and residual radiation were the result of contact with extraterrestrial beings. However, many questions remain unanswered. Why was radiation only found on the clothing of 2 participants, while others found nearby were not contaminated? Why wasn't radiation detected on the skin and bones of the victims? And of course, why was the additional radiation test conducted after the case had been closed? Version number 4, conspiracy theory. One of the most popular theories. It suggests that 2 members of the expedition were agents of the Soviet Secret Service, the KGB, Zolotaryov and Kolevatov. The expedition itself was an ideal cover for the transfer of some secret information in the mountains to representatives of foreign intelligence. It was also necessary to take photographs of the participants. The theory posits that the materials in question were related to the Soviet nuclear program. According to this theory, the idea was that foreign intelligence would genuinely believe the information was valuable, but in reality, it was disinformation, and the entire operation was meticulously controlled by the KGB. Whatever the case, it's clear that something went wrong. The theory suggests that foreign agents realized they were being deceived and decided to eliminate the entire group. Their plan was to force the group outside and let them freeze to death, making the deaths appear natural. However, something went wrong, and part of the group fought back, which explains the rib and skull fractures. Those injuries from the application of great force. It also makes sense that Zolotaryov and Kolevatov were found near each other, as they likely tried to resist. Furthermore, Ludmila Devanina, found near them, was missing her tongue, which seems to point to the involvement of foreign agents. The camera found on Zolotaryov's body supports the theory that, as a KGB agent, he was tasked with taking photos of special agents. Another interesting fact that reinforces the idea that Zolotaryov was a KGB agent is the way his name was recorded on the collective grave of the group members. He is listed as Zolotarev AI, using the name Alexander, which he introduced himself with on the day the group met, even though his passport identified him as Simeon. On his personal gravestone, however, his name is listed as Zolotaryov Simeon Alexeyevich, exactly as it appears in his passport. This discrepancy is certainly suspicious. Indeed, the theory about Zolotaryov being a KGB agent has led some to believe that the inexplicable combination of letters in his tattoos could be a code known only to other agents. Supporters of this theory argue that the lack of direct evidence only demonstrates the professionalism of the foreign agents involved. However, the absence of clear evidence primarily highlights the lack of proof, rather than confirming the validity of the KGB agent theory. Without solid evidence to support such a claim, it remains speculative and inconclusive. While the theory is intriguing, it doesn't provide a definitive answer to the mystery of the Dyatlov Pass incident. Despite all the facts and theories presented, the Dyatlov Pass case remains an unsolved mystery to this day. Nonetheless, the authorities were required to provide an official version, and it was concluded that the cause of death was a natural force that the tourists were unable to overcome. It seems that the Dyatlov Pass incident is one of those stories where there's plenty of information, but not enough to provide a clear answer about what really happened on that fateful night of February 1st, 1959.